Welcome everyone. My name is Miriam Klimova. I am a rabbi in Haifa. I'm really glad I can be here with all of you. So we are continuing the discussion about turning points in Jewish history. So today we'll be talking about Kabbalah, how it entered into Judaism. We'll be saying that Kabbalah had a great influence on the life of Jews, that there were many different Kabbalistic ideas, and based on that we had, for example, Hasidism. It was many centuries later, but that's where Hasidism is coming from, as well as different movements that came before Hasidism. But right now we'll be discussing how Kabbalah is influencing our life as well, because we can feel its influence during every service. So before we move into something so great, so fascinating, let's shortly discuss the foundations of Judaism. Torah, Nevi'im, Ktuvim, so the 5 books of Moses, the writings, and the prophets. Then we say in our history, okay, we have the Torah Shebichtav, the written one, but we also have the oral tradition. And we always say that the oral tradition was being passed from Moses through the next generations. And we say that it comes exactly from the times of the revelation at Sinai. Then, with which generation you have a tradition of commentaries on the written Torah, of passing on the oral Torah, and this all has to be compiled into one law, which is called halacha. But when we say combine it into one law, it may seem that it's something fixed that never changes, but that's not how it is. The word halacha comes from the word lelehet, a verb which means to go, to walk. And this reflects the fact that Jewish law changes. It changes with the times. We discuss the Mishnah, the Jerusalem and the Babylonian Talmud, and when they were created. The compilation of the Mishnah is the beginning of the 3rd century. And then we have the eras of sages, Chazal, of the sages of the Talmud, who created the Mishnah and the Gemara, so the Talmud itself. And this era ends in the 6th century of the Common Era. Then we have the Geonim, and then the Rishonim era. We discussed this era, but right now we are still in those times. Because if we use this mysterious word Kabbalah, this is the movement of Jewish mysticism. So this is mysticism, is the studying of the mystery. So when we talk about studying the mystery, let's discuss the origins. What were the origins of mysticism in Jewish tradition? So the beginnings of Kabbalah stem from Jewish thought and from the ancient Jewish mysticism. And that's the Sifrut of Chehalot and Merkavot, this literature. So the literature of palaces and of the chariot. It's a compilation of mystical Jewish texts. And it's difficult to discuss when exactly they were created. So it took place gradually. Some say from the 3rd century, some say from the first one, up to the 9th century. And these texts were written and edited by Jewish writers and scholars up to the Middle Ages. And as for their origins, I'd like to mention one more sentence, one more text of Professor Rachel Elior, and she says that these texts most probably appeared as standalone texts relatively late. In the next era, no earlier than the 7th century, so when we already have Islam influencing our history. We talked about it, about Islam in Spain. So she tells us that this literature that we say it's the basis of Jewish mysticism has been developed well, not from the very early times, from Moses at Sinai, but people study these texts. They study which words we can find in various texts. So if we think about the influence of literature on us, then of course the first interesting thing is that not everyone has heard the words Heihalot or Merkavot or mysticism, but we are all familiar with the Siddur. The one I have is the one used in Warsaw, Siddur Beit Polin. And even if a regular Reform Siddur, just like in other prayer books, we find in the Amidah prayer these words. That's page 140. Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot. So we say that holy, holy, holy is Adonai. The full earth is full of His glory. And then we say, may His glory be blessed wherever He is. So if we look at these words, we see that they are quite similar to those used in the literature we are discussing, the Heihalot literature. So the words are the same. So what's the Heihalot literature about? And the word Heihalot, palaces, talks about the palaces in heaven. That's where God is sitting on the throne in His kingdom. And all the angels come up to Him. And we also have Merkavot, chariots. One of the prophets talks about chariots. Does anyone know which one? By Jeremiah? Ezekiel. Yes, that's right. Ezekiel. So in the book of prophet Ezekiel, in various chapters, we see descriptions of Merkavot, of chariots. So literature gives us certain tips, guidance on how angels are going up to heaven or going down to earth. So you have to be active. You need human action. And it says that this happens through speech and through ritual. So somehow you can influence, determine whether you'll meet with God. So the idea is to reach a high level of spirituality in order to meet with the Almighty. And historically, the Heihalot literature was written in Hebrew. Some passages are in Aramaic, but almost all of it is in Hebrew. And as for these descriptions, these are not sermons or commentaries to the Torah. It's a separate narrative that talks about the spiritual experiences of the mystic whose soul is ascending towards the throne of divine glory. And on the way, it is moving through different antechambers of the heavenly palaces. And of course, angels are guarding these palaces. So this path leads through seven heavenly spheres. So one after the other, the mystic moves through them. And his soul is presented to the angels. And the angels are kind of contradicting it. So the mystic is in danger, basically. But if someone is able to complete the whole journey, they get a chance to enter the palace in the seventh heavenly sphere, and they have the privilege of standing in front of the throne of God and to see his glory. So this is the Heihalot literature. You have various liturgies, poems, the texts of the angels. That's why we gave this example. And the Heihalot literature tells us what the angels are saying. So, in the time framework, this literature is the foundation of Jewish mysticism. So Rabbi Marc says this is the beginning of the 2nd century. Some other scholars say maybe the 3rd century. Some, like Professor Elior, say that no, it's from later times. So we don't have an exact date. But even if you use the earliest date, then that's the beginning of mysticism. And then mysticism becomes more popular during the Crusades. We have Hasidei Ashkenaz. This is not connected with the Hasidic movement, which will be established many centuries later in Poland. But who were those Hasidei Ashkenaz? Those were Jews who lived in Ashkenaz. So already back then, their life was quite difficult. And since it was difficult, usually in a difficult situation, it so happens that people try not to think about the problems that they face every day. If there is a war, sometimes people feel such despair that they would rather think about some broader, more general topics about heavenly angels, about the divine glory, about something more lofty. And that's to believe that the miserly life that they are experiencing is not everything, that there is something else. And in those times, the Kabbalah becomes to be widespread. So we have a movement that is well known, and that is the 12th century. So we have two places. One of them is Provence in France, and on the other hand, you have Spain, northern Spain. So what's happening in Spain? we already know. So, on the one hand, you had the golden age of the Jewish tradition or of Jewish culture, because in those times Spain was conquered by Muslims and life was quite good. And that's because in those times Jews could hold quite prominent positions. We talked about Maimonides, who was the physician of the elites. But later, Spain was reconquered by Christians. So, this is the historical background that led to the development of mysticism. So, if you have mysticism, the revelation, the seeking the Almighty, we have two main events that became the foundation of Judaism. One of them is Moses, as we can see. So the revelation of the Torah, and the people at Mount Sinai received the Torah. That's one of them. And what's the second event? That is something that happened earlier. It was the time when God was revealed to Abraham. That was the very beginning of Jewish history. So, what's the foundation of Judaism? It's a commentary related to those two events. We are interpreting these two events. And that's because in both of these instances, people were communicating with God. So the experience of studying, of remembering such events may seem something distant. Today we may say something virtual, something distant, archaic. So, okay, someone back in the day communicated with God, but what does that have to do with me? So I think that the waves of Jewish mysticism over the course of centuries can be seen as a manifestation, an expression of a certain rebellion. Because the mystic is asking us, why do we have to accept that a direct meeting with God was something that could only happen back in the ancient times, that it's not something that's available to us? So it's a rebellion against the current times, the current beliefs. So why can't I, or why can't you individually, as every single person, get in touch with God, communicate with God? And here tensions arise. Because on the one hand, you have the mystic experience, but on the other hand, you have a stable tradition. So if in each generation, every person would say, okay, I talked to God and he gave us yet another message, then it would seem that everyone could say, well, I have a new Torah. Everyone could say, I'm a new prophet and I'm speaking on behalf of God. And in that case, we could think that the tradition based on Moses is something obsolete, that now we have something new. So, on the one hand, that is a problem. But on the other hand, the mystic approach allows you to have a new interpretation, a new hope. It gives you a new energy, a possibility to feel that all the commandments that I'm observing still have some meaning, still have a purpose, because maybe sometime in the future there will be a meeting with God, a communication with God. So, how was this movement accepted by rabbinic Judaism? Well, we get a sense if we know that the Talmud does not mention any Kabbalistic texts, it does not talk about the experience of meeting with the Almighty. But we had different poems, liturgical practices, various commentaries. All these things were present in the tradition, they were absorbed by it. So such ideas were present, but they never led to any radical changes. So what led to the expansion of mysticism? As we said, the historical background, difficult times. So there was a new mystical school in Spain and in Provence, and here we have two additional factors that contributed to it. So one of them was the fact that mysticism was well developed in the Christianity of medieval Europe. So in spite of the cultural distance between Christians and Jews, Jewish thinkers were probably inspired by their surroundings and encouraged to study theosophy. So if you are in Babylonia, then they were inspired by the Babylonian tradition, which is reflected in the Talmud. If we live in medieval Europe and we are surrounded by Christianity, then we also have such influences. And the same goes for Islam. We do have some influences from the Islam tradition. That's how new traditions, new ideas develop. You have new works. So there's nothing wrong with that. So that was the first factor. And on the other hand, the growing popularity of Jewish mysticism can be also explained by the fact that maybe it was an expression of the fact that they were not satisfied with the establishment back then by the leadership. So the rabbis, lay oligarchs. So we are not satisfied with the leadership, so we'd like a different movement. We'd like to believe in something else. We don't like the corruption. We don't like the elite. And that's how several centuries later Hasidism appeared, because the Jewish tradition was so inaccessible to regular people, to normal people, that as we hear in different tales, that people just wanted to whistle, and that would be interpreted as an honest intention, kavanah, rather than some complicated prayers. So we see the two factors, and that's how we can try to explain why Kabbalah became so popular in those times. So this new school of Kabbalah was developing, and the first center of Kabbalah was Girona in the northeast of Spain.
O czym ona w ogóle mówi? Mówi nam o tym, że między Bogiem a człowiekiem.
So Kabbalah basically tells us that there is a specific path between a human and God. So the Kabbalists believe that God created the world and God has some emanations which are affecting each other. And that between the infinite God and the finite world, in between those things you have the emanations. So the Kabbalists, as mystics, wanted to become one with God, to unify with God. And how to do that? Well, you have to shorten
między
the
światem nieskończonym,
distance
światem
between
najwyższym.
the infinite
Jest świat
world, the one
nieskończony,
above, and the finite world, the
materialny świat.
material world. So a
Kabbalista
Kabbalist perceives
postrzega
the
całą
whole material
rzeczywistość
reality
materialną
and
jako
all its
zjawisko
phenomena as a
jako
symbolic
system
system
symboliczny,
which
który
reflects
odzwierciedla
God's
wyraz
revelations
Boga
in
w
the
świecie.
world.
Dąży do tego, żeby podnieść się w
So
stopniu
their
doskonałości
aspiration is to keep
swojej
on
duchowej.
improving,
I to
increasing their
właśnie
spirituality
wpłynęło
to make
na
it as perfect
przywrócenie
as
duszy
possible, and that's
do
how the soul can go
prawdziwego
back
źródła
to the
stworzenia.
Almighty, the source of
Więc
creation.
w takim razie Kabbała pokazuje tajemne
So
aspekty,
Kabbalah is
które mogą pomóc
emphasizing
człowiekowi
certain
w tym,
aspects
żeby
that can
duchowo
help
mógł
people grow
wzrosnąć.
spiritually.
Tak, nazwiemy to współczesnymi terminami, ale to
We can
właśnie o to
describe it
chodzi.
in modern terms, but
Najczęściej te
that's what it's all
aspekty
about.
boskości,
So
do
usually
których
the
musimy dążyć, nazywają
aspects of
mianami
God that we should
10
aspire to are
żywiołów,
called the 10 Sefirot,
czyli
so
emanacje.
emanations.
Takie
These are
emanacje, przez które
emanations through
Bóg
which
przejawia
God
swoje
is
działania
displaying his
oraz za
actions,
pomocą których
and
stworzył świat.
these are the emanations
I
through which
właśnie tym
God
światem
created the world and is
zarządza.
managing the world through them.
Podstawowym tekstem, na który opiera się Kabbała,
The main
jest to
text
księga
of
Zohar.
Kabbalah
Sefer
is
HaZohar.
Zohar,
Zohar
Sefer
przez
HaZohar,
tłumaczymy Sefer HaZohar
splendor.
jako
That's
blask.
how we
Znowu
translate
tutaj
the
mamy odniesienie
Hebrew. And here again,
do
it's a
Ezechiela,
reference to
ponieważ
Ezekiel
w
because
Biblii mówi się o blasku,
the word
czyli
splendor is often mentioned in
kiedy
his book.
próbujemy ustalić, przez kogo była stworzona
So, who was
Biblia,
the author of this book?
to tradycja
The
kabbalistów
tradition, Kabbalists
wierzymy, że
believe
Zohar
that the
powstał
Zohar
na chwilę
originated in the
Shimon Bar
circles of
Yochai.
Rabbi Shimon Bar
Bardzo dobrze
Yochai.
znany.
He was a prominent figure. It
Mówimy,
is
że
said
grób
that
Szymona Bar
the
Yochaja
tomb
znajduje się
of
w
Shimon Bar
Judeo i
Yochai
tam właśnie zbierają
is
się wszyscy mistycy
on
współcześni,
Mount
napierdzielają
Nebo, and that's where all
robią
the
wielkie
modern
świętowania.
Kabbalists gather during Lag
Szymon Bar
BaOmer. They
Yochai
celebrate
jest
back then.
postacią z drugiego
Shimon
wieku
Bar
Common
Yochai
Era
lived in the
i
second century of Common Era.
właśnie tak, sama ta
The book
książka pisana
itself
jest
was
po
written in
aramejsku.
Aramaic.
Szymon Bar
Shimon Bar
Yochai
Yochai
jest
was a
Tanaim,
Tanaim,
czyli jeszcze
so
przed
it was in the times
redagowaniu
before the
Biblii.
Mishnah was
W
compiled.
jego imieniu przytacza się
And
reguły
Rabbi Yehuda
bardzo
Hanassi
dużo halachowych
mentions
praw,
many halachot,
które
which he says
to powiedział
were
Szymon Bar
stated
Yochai.
by
I
Shimon
to
Bar
tak
Yochai.
przyjmujemy. Tak? I właśnie
So,
on
according to
jako
the
tradycja
tradition,
jest
he was the
autorem
author of the
Księgi
book of
Zohar.
Zohar.
A jednak w tej księdze
But
pojawiają
in
się
this book,
hiszpańskie
we
słowa.
see Spanish words and
Hiszpańskie
sentence
struktury
structure
zdania, ponieważ można mówić po
because,
polsku, jak niby ja, ale można
right, if
przetłumaczyć
you
swoje
translate
zdanie
from a
na inny
different
język
language,
i
then
raczej
sometimes you
odtwarzam,
can feel that the structure of the
że
language is different.
budowa zdania przypomina tutaj w konkretnym przykładzie Księgi
So
Zohar
here,
język hiszpański.
in the case of
Są
Zohar, you have
przeniesienia do wydarzeń
Spanish
historycznych,
phrases.
które nie
They
są
also
zrozumiałe
reference
i człowiek nie mógł znać
medieval
znaczenia.
historical events
A jedynie
that no
hiszpański
one
na
who lived in
początku
the second century could know about. So
XIII wieku na pewno te
then it was
objawy miało
believed that the
powstać.
book was
I
created in
dlatego
the
uważa się,
13th century.
że tak jak księga ta została po raz pierwszy opublikowana przez kabalistę
And the book was
Rabbi Moshe de Leon,
first
tak ono
published by a
właśnie
Kabbalist, Rabbi
według
Moshe
większości
de Leon.
badaczy
So
była
most scholars
stworzona
believe that he was
przez
also the
Moshe.
author of this
I
book.
tak mniej więcej od 1000 lat później
So
aniżeli
about
wcześniej.
1000 years later than they previously
Została
thought.
bestsellerem.
So
Tak?
the book became a
Dlaczego? No,
bestseller.
z jednej strony na
Why?
pewno
Well, on the one
dzięki
hand, thanks to
autorytetowi
the
księgi
authority
Szymona Bar
of
Yochaja. Bo
Rabbi
zawsze czytanie
Shimon
Biblii jest
Bar Yochai.
po prostu tak, książka. Wzrost tam. To jest książka, która
because they believed that it's not a new book, it's a book that has been passed on from generation to generation. It was reprinted many times.
Właśnie, jeżeli mówimy o tej książce, to trzeba powiedzieć, że właśnie główna część
And
księgi składa
the
się
main
z
part of the book are lectures, drashot, interpretations, which are ascribed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And here, let me correct myself. His tomb is believed to be on Mount Meron.
To zawsze gdzieś są w drodze. To też chyba coś odzwierciedla.
And this is also important because we have people who are always seeking the Almighty, but they are constantly during a journey, they keep on going somewhere. And the same goes for the rabbi who was also providing information or lectures to his disciples, or they were having a meal together, and that's when he was sharing information with his disciples. You have also liturgical parts, more poetic ones. You have Kabbalistic visions, mainly in the lectures. So all the sermons are ordered according to the weekly parashot. And this also tells us a lot about the time when this book was written. And the book is written almost entirely in Aramaic.
Intensywne studiowania nad Kabbalą zostają dla elity, tak, widzimy, że
So from this period forward, while intensive scholarship in Kabbalah remained the province of elite circles of experts, nonetheless its influence spilled over into the mainstream. Its terms and symbols became parts of the liturgical texts, as we already saw. They became a part of the practices and Torah study. And with time, it spread over a broader community. And an important channel for this popularization was the Torah commentary of a well-known scholar that we see here on the slide, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman. We call him Nahmanides, Ramban. So before we talked about Rambam, Maimonides, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. And there are many jokes about this because they lived basically more or less in the same time. Maimonides was a bit older. So what was Nahmanides famous for, and why are his ideas, his way of thinking, so different from the ones of Maimonides? So he was a well-known scholar. So we can say that Ramban, Nahmanides, played the same role in Christian Spain as Maimonides, Rambam, played during the Golden Age in Spain under Islam rule. So they were both very prolific. They wrote many texts, commentaries to the Torah. They were active in the cultural world. They were engaged in politics. Nahmanides was also a physician, like Rambam. He spent most of his life in Christian Spain. He was born in the place that we already mentioned, in Girona, in Catalonia.
Kiedy o nim mówimy, to musimy powiedzieć, że właśnie urósł pod wpływem rozwoju tej tradycji kabalistycznej.
He was influenced by the development of the Kabbalist tradition, and at the same time, Maimonides was focusing on realism, on the rational thinking, the rational aspects of Jewish tradition, but Nahmanides, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, is focused on something a little bit different. He created a bridge. So he was the bridge towards mysticism. So, but we will see soon that he's not really completely against the rationalist tradition. So, as we said, he wrote a commentary to the Torah, a well known text, and as printing was invented, it became very popular, and he wrote in a very reader friendly way. It was easy to understand. He wrote legal tractates about various topics related to human life, death and mourning, marital relations. He also wrote a commentary on the book of Maimonides, or a critique of Maimonides, actually. So sometimes they would not agree with each other. So he wrote a critique of the Sefer HaMitzvot of Maimonides. So we have two well-known historical events that tell us a lot about his character and his approach. So let's take a look at them. One of them is related to Maimonides, to Rambam. So when Rambam, Nahmanides, was about 40 years old, a large discussion broke out about the text of Maimonides. And the text was the Guide for the Perplexed. We already said that this book was being burned by Christians, but also because Jews were also complaining about this text. And why? Maimonides wrote a rationalist book. For example, the Guide for the Perplexed, as well as others. So there was a big controversy both among Christians and Jews when it comes to those texts. So we had the controversy about Maimonides when Maimonides' writings were seeking to reconcile rationalist philosophy with Jewish belief. Then Christians started to read the texts in Spain and in France, and they viewed them very negatively, both Christians and Jews, because it's all related to various influences. And can you understand God in a rational way? No, they said you need a mystical approach that was becoming popular both in Christianity and in Judaism. So Rambam, Maimonides, said, no, if you want to study the Torah, mysticism, mystical practices are not enough. Before that, if you want to be worthy of understanding, studying the books of prophets, you have to study mathematics, medicine, science. This is all connected. So Nahmanides was already back then considered to be a rabbinical authority, even though he was younger, and he sided with the critics of the rationalist philosophy, so of Maimonides and his teachings.
Jednocześnie, że
So he
samo
sided with
pozostawanie
the
krytykiem
critics, but at the same time,
zawsze
he
był
was a very
sposobem
wise person,
przemawiania
a very calm
spokojny,
person,
który dawał
and he
okazję
was
do
advising on a
dialogu,
dialogue, on respect.
Niestety
Well,
zdarzyło się też
unfortunately,
tak, co
no
mówił?
one listened to
Mówił,
him.
okej, tak,
Nahmanides
tak
said,
mówisz,
yes, that's
ale
what Maimonides
możesz to
said,
pojąć w
but we
swoim
have to
państwie.
understand
To było
that
dobre
in
stanowisko
back in
wobec
his time it was a good approach towards tradition to understand the
Teraz
text.
tak nie
So maybe
mówimy,
today we do
tak,
not have
korzystaj,
to make
ale
use of
nie
that,
trzeba być
but let's not
aż
be
tak
so radical about it.
radykalnymi, tak? Co się dzieje, czym się ten cała
So
opowieść
how did this
kończy?
end?
Tym, że jego słowa nie
Well,
przemawiały tak. Coraz
no one
bardziej
listened to
ostry
him.
stawał się
The
dyskurs
discourse
o
about the books of
średniowieczu.
Maimonides were becoming increasingly
Wielu franciszkanów
severe,
właśnie jego
and
książki zostały
in
spalone
many
też przez
towns, the books of Maimonides were burned because Jews were also complaining about them, and
Więc te dzieła
Christians did it.
nauki i te dzieła, które próbowały
So you
wyjaśnić
had books
logicznie,
in which they were trying to explain logically
kim jest
what's
wszechświat,
the essence of God
co
and
dzieje
what's the essence of the world,
w
but back
czasie
then they were not
zbawieniowania.
received favorably.
Drugi temat, drugie wydarzenie, z którego znamy bardzo dobrze
And the second event
Nahmanidesa,
connected
dosyć
to
ciekawe.
Nahmanides is
Tutaj w
also well
ogóle
known, the disputation of Barcelona in 1263.
Tutaj w ogóle powiem
I'll
krótko,
give you
ale
a short,
zachęcam do
brief
czytania.
background, but I encourage you to read about
Był
it.
następny dyskurs. Król powiedział
So
do
the king
tego
said, invite
Nahmanidesa, żeby
Nahmanides to
wyjaśnił nam,
explain to
dlaczego,
us
dlaczego na
if,
przykład
for
Maria
example, if he
Jezus
thinks that Jesus
był
was the Messiah,
Mesjaszem.
or can the
Czy może
Messiah come?
czy teksty z Talmudu Babilońskiego, a był taki jeden nowo obrócony ojciec
There was
w kościele,
this
który był
apostate
wcześniej
in the
byłym
church who used to be a Jew, then he became a Christian, and he said
idea o
that no, the
trójcy
idea of the
były
Trinity actually comes
Talmudu
from the
i mogę
Talmud,
to
and
uzasadnić. Więc
I
był
can
dyskurs przez 4 dni.
justify that, I can explain that.
Ojciec
So the discussion lasted for 4 days.
Pablo
So
Cristiano
the Christian,
mówił tam,
Pablo
że
Cristiani,
zadawał
kept
pytania
on talking. He was asking
odpowiadał,
questions, and
wszystkim
Nahmanides was
odpowiadał,
just answering
cały
the
czas
questions.
odpowiadał
So he kept on
i
answering,
koniec tej
and
debaty był taki, że sam król
the end was that
powiedział,
the
że
king himself
powiedział
said,
następnie:
let
niech
the
ta
debate
debata
be
zostanie
adjourned, for I have
odwołana,
never seen
ponieważ
a
nikt
man
nie
who
widział
was
człowieka
wrong argue his case
błądzącego,
as well
który by
as you.
argumentował swoją sprawę tak dobrze jak ty. Czyli w dysputach Nahmanides był
So
o tyle
Nahmanides
wielki,
was
że
great in
zachęcał króla,
discussions,
powiedział:
so great
okej,
that even the
bądź
king
taki,
said, okay, let's
zgodź się bądź bądź.
agree to disagree.
Kiedy
And that's how it
czytamy
ended.
jego komentarze na jego dzieła, to bardzo ciekawe jest zobaczyć, jak z jednej strony nie, nie jest
So when we look at the
oryginalny
texts of
w
Nahmanides, it's
kabalistycznej
very
filozofii,
interesting that
ale
he's not an
powiedział z drugiej
original
strony, że musi
Kabbalist
popularyzować.
creator, author, but he believes that
Mówił
he
dla
has
Żydów
to spread
o
the
jakiejś
Kabbalah to make it more
o
popular.
właśnie samej Kabbale, nie stwarza Kabbale. Ale
Let me give you an
inne, na
example.
przykład
So that is the
do
introduction to the commentary
komentarza
on the
Księgi
book of Bereshit.
Komentuje, powiedzieliśmy,
So it's a commentary on the 5 books of Moses, and he writes an introduction before
razem
each
komentarzy do każdej
book.
księgi. I mówi od יש בידינו קבלה של אמת. zwróćcie uwagę, kiedy
So he uses the word
Kabbalah,
Kabbalah when he says we have a true tradition.
czyli
So the word Kabbalah here
tutaj odczuć
comes from the verb lekabel, to receive, and
że
it's
będzie
kind of a synonym to the word tradition, so something that we've received from the previous generations. And this tells us that the whole Torah consists of the names of the Holy One, blessed be He, and that if the division into words is changed from the traditional division, the letters form names of God. This is why we may not use a Torah scroll in which even one letter is added or subtracted in error, even if the error has no consequence for the meaning of the verse.
znaczenie wersetu.
So,
Czyli co
what
on
is he
tutaj
doing
robi?
here?
To jest przykład,
That's an
żeby
example
słowo
of a
wyjaśnienie
Kabbalist explanation of a
wszyscy znają, że nie można
well known law. We all know that you cannot make mistakes if you are
zły to
preparing a Torah scroll. A Torah scroll has to be perfect. So Ramban tells us that even if the mistake does not change the content, the meaning, then nonetheless we cannot use
jego
it.
komentarz wyraża
So
koncepcję
this commentary expresses an important Kabbalistic notion that letters and words in the Hebrew Bible
mają
have a
znaczenie,
significance that
wykracza
goes
poza
beyond the plain meaning, the simple meaning.
że właśnie właściwe szkolenie i motywacja
That the appropriate training and motivation allows the students of Kabbalah to find a new secret meaning of the Torah. And they say that the whole Torah is simply a set of various names of the Holy One. So keep on looking, maybe you'll find something.
Szukajcie,
Maybe this is
tutaj
the
dużo drogi.
mysterious path.
O tej drodze to jeszcze mówi. Dalej, kiedy już komentuje Księgę Bereścitu,
So
jest bardzo dużo komentarzy,
he comments extensively on the first verses of Genesis.
i mówi nam następne.
So Maaseh Bereshit, the act of creation, is a deep mystery that cannot be understood from the plain text, and it cannot be fully known except through the tradition going back to Moses, our teacher, who received it from the mouth of God.
Otrzymał ją z ust Boga.
So he says that we have an oral tradition which is being passed on, and it can help people to understand the mystery, and those who know what it is are supposed to hide it.
Oto to jeden.
Those who know it are obligated to conceal it.
Więc
So he doesn't tell us what the mystery is,
ale mówi nam,
but he tells us
że nie myślcie, że
do not think that the only way to understand something is through logic. There is a greater mystery, a deeper way of thinking, which is passed on, but we don't know by who, by the greatest thinkers and mystics.
i mistyków. I tutaj właśnie też
And he
mówi nam w
says,
swoim komentarzu,
he talks about Sfirot, the emanations.
przez długą drogę
The words of
jak
Bereshit
słowo
is shedding light on important matters, that it tells us
powiązane
how the root Bereshit, the beginning, is connected and how it differs. And he describes how creation is described in various places of the Hebrew Bible. And he says, the word Bereshit points to the fact that the world was created by the 10 emanations, Eser Sfirot. And
i nawiązuje w szczególności
here he talks first of all about the emanation of Chokhmah, of wisdom, which is the foundation of everything. Because, as this said,
przewodzi nam tutaj
and here the verse from Proverbs comes to mind.
że mądrość,
So, why is he saying that wisdom, this emanation, is the foundation of everything? So, as an example, he says,
nam następny werset Adonai bechochma yasav aretz.
The Lord founded the earth by wisdom.
ziemię. Ktoś może powiedzieć, że tak,
So someone
jesteśmy
might
trochę przywiązani.
be wondering if this is right, if this is the right approach.
Aluzje
But mysticism sees the suggestions or similar words or synonyms as something that is interconnected and something that can show us the path, the way leading to new discoveries and new spiritual studies.
Jeżeli mówimy
And as
o
for
sobie,
Nahmanides himself,
poprzez te wszystkie jego idei, jeden raz po
then after the Barcelona dispute, well, he was fine, but then after a couple of years, he had to run away from the Christian authorities. And then he traveled to Eretz Israel, to the land of Israel. He probably moved to Jerusalem.
Mówi się, że to było mniej więcej w
It
roku
was around 1267. So after he moved to Jerusalem, they said that he established a synagogue and a Beit Midrash. But we don't know what happened towards the end of his life. He disappeared somewhere. We don't know exactly what happens to him. So if we are looking for conclusions, even of today's short meeting, we did not talk about the main ideas of Kabbalah. We talked about the history of the development, how the idea became widespread. So the popularization of Kabbalah, which radiated from Christian Spain, it had an important influence on even modern Jewish practices all across the world. So mysticism stems from those times, this place, from northern Spain, and then with every generation, this idea, then it came to Safad in the 16th century, to Safed, and that's, we could say, how we have Kabbalat Shabbat, the prayer that comes before the mandatory prayer during Shabbat evening. So we have a whole sequence of prayers that come before. We have Psalms, Piyutim, like Lecha Dodi, for example. This is mysticism from the 16th century. So the Piyut, Lecha Dodi, when we sing it today, well, we think it's nice, but we don't think that we are trying to influence the emanation of God, but actually it was created exactly with such an intent. So no matter with what understanding we approach this text, nonetheless, we are making use of it. So Jewish mysticism has never been and probably will never be the main movement of Judaism, but this being said, it has some unique, beautiful ideas. Historically, people were always fighting with them, but it has great influence on Jewish texts. It created some beautiful texts and literature, which had influence over normal life. Because even today, if you have Jews who say they are not religious, I'm sure that everyone has heard Shalom Aleichem and Lecha Dodi, and they know the melodies well, and they know what Kabbalat Shabbat is, and they are using mystical terms in their everyday life, and they are making use of the tradition that has been gifted to us exactly through this movement. So that's what I wanted to share today as this introduction to this topic. And this is the 15th chapter of the book of Rabbi Rosen. Rabbi Rosenstein.
Możemy skończyć.
And now, if you have any questions, then
Dziękuję bardzo za uwagę.
let's discuss it.